also think that what we have come to understand, or idolize rather, and what adults have come to consider perfect Montessori schools in the last probably dozen years, or maybe 15 years, these idealized, perfect looking Nienhuis catalog kind of places is not really I don't think that's what Montessori envisioned. It's certainly not what you take away from these articles that we've read, the article that she wrote, first of all. And Peller wasn't, Peller just was, it is just like a parallel. She wasn't even really like a Montessori person per se. But I think, like, for instance, in the article that we read about Montessori, that Montessori wrote, she never even mentions math and language. It's us. And so in that, when you look at it that way, you think it could be any school. What she described could be any learning environment. It did not seem like it was dependent upon what we would, the full complement of Montessori materials. Montessori herself did not even mention. So I think what you're saying about, if you take what we understand about what she was doing with the environment was providing private spaces, where children are free to explore and discover, where adults make observations and modify the environment based on those observations, that you're doing that. And that is Montessori, And there's also, I think it's in Dr. Montessori's own handbook, where she says, it might not be in Dr. Montessori's own handbook, it might be in the Montessori method. Regardless, what she says is that the school should be able to have at their disposal the most that they can afford, right? So it doesn't even have to be like super fancy stuff. I truly believe you can have Montessori outside, you could have an outside school with Montessori principles. That it's really just like you're talking about when you say the essence. When I think that philosophy can infuse any kind of learning environment that you have. And that while, yes, the Montessori language and math materials, all that kind of stuff is fabulous, that in and of itself does not make a Montessori environment. Because you can have some pretty not comfy, not child-centered stuff and have all the materials, and that is not a prepared environment for children, So I'm glad you brought that up.
And the other thought that I had, Arti, when you were talking was when you said, what would Montessori do if she were alive today? The other question I keep asking myself is, how would her methodology be different today, right? If she were still alive, because there's so many, I don't know. I just think if she kept evolving and watching children, there would be some differences, for what it's worth.
Yeah. I wish we could see.
Yep.
But I think even if we look at where she started, like if we look at the environment that she created in the children's house and the apartment, which is great, was very different than when she was in India way later in her life, and she and Mario lived in a little apartment above her school, and they spent most of their day outside. That was an evolution. It's an evolution from where she talks about in Dr. Montessori's own handbook, the schedule of the day, where they come in and introduce themselves and then have collective exercises and walk around the line, and then they do intellectual exercises, and then they eat lunch, and then they make bricks. That was very regimented. And then at the end, what we see is a much less regimented. I have often wondered how influenced she would be by something like Angie Play. Has anybody heard of Angie Play? Like how attracted she would have been to Angie Play, or what she would have thought about something like Rye, or even Reggio. Like I believe that there are certain aspects of all of those things that are not in opposition to Montessori's philosophy, and those environments have something to offer. Just as I feel like the way that she moved towards really honoring the outside educational environment toward the end of her life, like what would have happened if she had continued with that, right?
Yep.
So, yeah.
Yep. So in my mind, when you're talking about that, what has always struck me is that Montessori's environments were completely different everywhere she went. Right? Her environments in Barcelona and her environments in Holland they're nothing like the environments in India. And I think that's a really important thing for us to remember, because she always said that our school has to be a reflection of the world that we live in.
Of the culture of that
So,
child that child lives in.
exactly.
Yeah.
So it's looking at where we are, but it's also looking at when we are. And I just think that's one of the most crucial aspects that we often miss. You know, I love looking at pictures of Montessori environments all around the world. And I hate it when I see one, you know, in like a remote corner of Africa that could be here in Ontario. I'm like, no, that's not right.
The same thing in Asia often is that they're in the desire to provide the best Montessori environment. We people who are not in Asia, who are seeing this, who have seen this more consistently, have this idealized kind of neem who show house vision of what Montessori has to look like, instead of taking all the great things from their, you know, from the culture of that child, which Montessori very clearly says in that article from 1944 should be the basis of all of the exercises. I mean, that's what she says in the 1944 article, is that child's world should be what permeates that child's existence, you know. Have this idealized kind of neem who show house vision of what Montessori has to look like, instead of taking all the great things from their, you know, from the culture of that child, which Montessori very clearly says in that article from 1944 should be the basis of all of the exercises. I mean, that's what she says in the 1944 article, is that child's world should be what permeates that child's existence, you know, and what we should be working on.